So maybe you've heard about exposure therapy, you know that it's effective for social anxiety, but maybe when it comes time to do an exposure, you notice that your anxiety starts going up and you find yourself putting it off or avoiding it. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the ways that I encourage people to handle this difficulty starting. Hi, I'm Thomas Smithyman, PhD. I'm a clinical psychologist. I specialize in treating social anxiety. And today I'm going to do my first video responding to a comment from one of the viewers. So he says, I'm 40 years old, I've got social anxiety, and I struggle to bring myself to approach women. I know exposure is the best way, but I'm struggling to make my first approach. Okay, thanks for leaving the comment. This is a very common issue. Exposure therapy is effective, but it has a high dropout rate. That's its biggest problem. So this comes up all the time in the work that I do. And I have a few suggestions for how to get through this. Number one, start smaller. Whenever somebody tells me, oh, I was trying to do an exposure and I couldn't get myself to do it, the first thing we assume is it's too hard. It's set too high. So the first thing you want to do is look at what is a lower level, less anxiety provoking, less challenging exposure. You want to start, in general, start small and work your way up over time. One thing that's helpful is creating an exposure hierarchy. So thinking of 10 different situations, 20 different situations where you find yourself getting anxious or you find yourself avoiding, and then organize those from easiest to hardest. Then when it comes time to picking an exposure, start with something on the lower to moderate range and go and do that exposure enough times until you're used to it, and only then move up to the next level. In exposure, you really don't want to do giant leaps. Take small steps. In general, the best goal is one step ahead of where you currently are. So for a dating anxiety example, like the commenter, you might think, well, where does approaching women fall on my hierarchy? It's probably too high. Most guys that I've spoken to, that's up there. It's like one of the higher level ones. So think about what can you do down here, stuff that's easier than that. Maybe it's talking to a guy instead. Maybe it's talking to an acquaintance, someone you know but don't know well, and maybe it's just meeting maybe older people or younger people, like somebody who's not specifically that scary. Maybe it's just saying hi and moving on versus trying to have a big conversation. Wherever it is, this is too high, look for something smaller. Number two, be more specific. One of the problems with sort of general attempts to do exposure is that sometimes it's not really clear what you're doing or why you're doing it. People might think, well, I'm just going to go and talk to people. But the problem is they often have implicit goals of having a great response or people liking them, or they're not really clear on how they're going to get started with it. So I find that the more specific you are in setting your exposure goal, the more likely you are to follow it through with it. In general, we know too from the research that setting clear goals reduces social anxiety. So, think about it like being a scientist. Like, be really clear on what it is that you're testing. Like, what is it that you are doing, and what are you trying to gain from the results? What are you trying to understand? So, an example might be, let's say you're going to a social event of some kind. A specific goal would be, I will introduce myself to one person or 3 people. Or I will find someone who I've met before but don't know well, and I will ask them a couple of questions to learn more about them. Or it might be, I'm going to say hi to people as I walk past, maybe 5 people in total, or I'm going to tell a story. If you're one of those people who protects by not sharing information, maybe I will tell 3 stories to people tonight. Be really specific about it. Number 3, work on the other treatment components. So in social anxiety, exposure is helpful, but there are a number of other ways that we go about treating it that work together. So there's no reason why you want to start with exposure. You don't need to jump into it. You can very legitimately work on the other aspects of treatment first. In fact, that's what most people do. So you can start with cognitive interventions. So identifying what your fears are, identifying negative thoughts, and then looking at, do they fall into those categories of unhelpful thinking, things that show they're not very realistic, which for social anxiety are especially mind reading, that you know what people are thinking, overestimating the likelihood that things will go wrong, or catastrophizing how bad it would be if it did go wrong and how little you could cope. Then you also get into disputing those thoughts. So looking for the ways in which they're unrealistic and developing some more believable alternatives. So you can do that cognitive therapy. You also can do attention training, which involves learning to focus your attention externally. In social anxiety, we tend to focus on the self, and that gets the anxiety jumping up. So just by learning to control your attention, realizing when you're in your head, and externalizing to look at other people and the world around you, that alone brings your anxiety down. So you can work on that. You also could work on emotional regulation, which is learning to tolerate the discomfort and distress that comes up, rather than sort of responding in ways that make it worse. You can learn how to cope with that and respond in healthy ways. It's also a very important part of treatment. Number 4, apply those other skills to exposure itself. Those components are great for treating social anxiety, but they also can help you with the exposure. So the cognitive work helps you become more realistic about what is going to happen during an exposure, so you don't get as anxious. It makes the exposure seem safer, but also you tend to have done some work to figure out how you would cope if your fears come true. So it makes it easier to go do the exposure and to cope. The attention training lowers your anxiety when you're in the exposure, but research tells us it also makes exposure more effective. You're more easily able to process what's happening and understand when it goes well and how safe the environment is. So it helps you learn better because you're processing better. And then third, the emotional regulation. It's very useful because it helps you tolerate the distress before the exposure and during the exposure. And it also helps you deal with the feelings that come up afterwards, which sometimes you can get shame or depressive feelings coming up. Helps you cope better with those. So overall, those old skills can make the exposure easier and more effective. And number 5, get help and support. So that might be getting help and support from a psychologist like me, where somebody who can help you set the exposures up, define what we're doing and why, and can support you sometimes in the moment, or sometimes afterwards, going through it. So you feel like you have a team kind of helping you. You also can get some of that from a friend, having somebody who will come and do exposures with you, or will talk with you about them and support you afterwards. Or it also could come from joining a group and talking about it in a group setting. Okay, that's the video. Thanks for watching. I hope it was helpful. And this, again, was a viewer's comment that led to this video. So if you have any thoughts or questions or topics you want to hear about, please leave me comments and I'll try to make videos. Okay, thanks.